Hello, good afternoon where I am. Welcome to the next BIOL3468 Biodiversity and Conservation lecture. Today we're talking about restoration and two lectures on restoration. The first one is looking at the objectives of rehabilitation and restoration ecology. Basically, with this first lecture I want to put restoration ecology in a context, because humans carry out restoration ecology, but they have carried out rehabilitation for far longer and developed a lot of techniques which we can use in restoration ecology for rehabilitation. So our first lecture is objectives of rehabilitation and restoration ecology. So in this lecture I want to take a look at what is restoration ecology. I want to take a look at rehabilitation and restoration, or putting restoration in a context of rehabilitation. I want to take a look at the difficulty of restoration, a brief history of restoration ecology, and finally taking a look at manipulating succession for restoration, how we can put some of the techniques for restoration into a successional context. In the next lecture, I'm going to take a look at some of the different techniques for restoration. Both this lecture and the next lecture, the techniques lecture, are going to be supported, I guess, by the PDF Repairing the Rainforest, which is a collection of thoughts and experiences which have been put together by two rainforest restorers in northeast Queensland in Australia, and it's one of the better compilations or manuals of restoration ecology for rainforests which have been put together. So I put up a link to that on the My eLearning website. I think that you should take a read of it when you do get a chance. I'm not suggesting you read it all, but it's certainly a very good resource to have if you are ever going to get into any sort of restoration. So, what is restoration ecology, you ask? A web definition: ecological restoration, same as restoration ecology, is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. I think we need to put a caveat on that as well. No, actually we don't. I mean, restoration ecology is basically assisting this process. Now, where is restoration ecology most used? Ecological restoration, restoration ecology, is restoring the ecosystem that existed historically in an area. So it's a pretty defined sort of definition. Ecological restoration is restoring the ecosystem. So to be 100% successful, restoration ecology or a ecological restoration project needs to put back in place the ecosystem which existed in the area before it was degraded or destroyed by humans. So we need to be able to first of all understand what was there before by either historical records or by looking at ecosystems in the same general area, and then we can understand what sort of ecosystem and what sort of composition of species that ecosystem has, and then restoration ecology is the set of techniques which are used to try and get that ecosystem back in place. Ecological restoration is a type of rehabilitation, but it's a very defined type of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, though, is something which humans have been practicing for many thousands of years. If you look in your textbook, I think it's in this textbook, there are records of Chinese, at least a couple of thousand years ago, using rehabilitation techniques, specifically planting grasses to stabilize slopes and stabilize banks in their agricultural areas. So you can think of ecological restoration or rehabilitation as using or creating a living ecosystem to achieve some sort of goal or objective. And it's been carried out for many years. Ecological restoration, on the other hand, is not something which humans have readily or tried to attempt very much in the past, mainly because generally humans don't really see a natural ecosystem as a very beneficial ecosystem, at least until now, when we are losing these natural ecosystems, and therefore the habitats for many natural species. The value of ecological restoration or restoration ecology is becoming more and more realized by conservationists around the world. So ecological restoration now is becoming very important because we can save endangered species of plants and animals, but without an ecosystem to put them in after they've been saved, then we might as well just turn all the wildlife, all the biodiversity of the world into one big zoo. We need to restore the ecosystems so that those plants and animals can continue their existence and continue also their evolution through time. What is causing restoration ecology to become important? Ecosystem destruction and ecosystem degradation. We all know what ecosystem destruction is. Ecosystem degradation is the alteration of the structure and function of a natural ecosystem beyond its ability to repair itself. And quite often we can class ecosystem destruction by this same definition. So when all the plants and animals from this ecosystem are removed, all the trees are chopped down, all the animals removed, then we have the ecosystem converted to maybe some agricultural ecosystem. Quite often it's beyond the ability of that natural ecosystem to repair itself. However, some people would argue that that ecosystem will quite often repair itself eventually, and that all that ecological restoration does is speed up the process of that ecosystem's recovery. So if we took, say, an area of ex-Carony lands where they used to grow sugarcane, it's all pretty much abandoned now and growing elephant grass, and not really very productive. If we were to try and restore some of that land to rainforest, we would basically have to start at ground zero. We would have to try and recreate the ecosystem, which is very difficult. So ecosystem degradation is usually done these days. It's usually due to human activities. So things like logging, burning, clearing for agriculture, and so on are all activities humans carry out to destroy ecosystems, natural ecosystems. And restoring those natural ecosystems is restoration ecology. In terms of rainforest restoration ecology, and that's pretty difficult, or actually it is difficult and it's not difficult, because rainforest climates are very productive, they have very high primary productivity. You can usually see results from that type of restoration very quickly, within 5 years or so. The actual full restoration of those ecosystems, however, would probably take more like 100 years before all the species make it back to that area. And in fact, ecological restoration projects, given human society, human lifespans, and basically the maximum length of many research projects or restoration projects, which is usually 3 to 5 to 10 years, ecological restoration projects quite often can only put an ecosystem on a trajectory or a successional pathway that will eventually culminate in the original ecosystem. So an ecological restoration project will try and to achieve moving the ecosystem to a point where it can now start to recover on its own. In terms of rainforest restoration, what that usually means is to try and close the canopy in the area so that tree and woody vegetation dominates, and to massively reduce the chance of fire burning through the area, killing all the trees and returning it back to grassland. So rainforest ecological restoration projects quite often involve replacing grass or herbaceous plant species in an area with woody tree vegetation, which form a closed canopy, which is more resistant to fire, which is quite often one of the reasons why these ecosystems are degraded or destroyed in the first place. To do this, ecological restoration must deal with ecology, obviously, as the name suggests, but it must also deal with humans. It must also deal with the reasons why the area was degraded or destroyed in the first place. And that's probably one of the most important issues with restoration and restoration ecology, and one of the very first things which need to be sorted out before a restoration project takes place. And that's removing the reason why the ecosystem was degraded or destroyed in the first place. So if fire is the reason why it's been degraded and destroyed, you must find the reason for that fire occurring, and you must prevent that fire occurring in the future. If that doesn't happen, then your restoration attempt is basically doomed. And there are examples in Trinidad which we will go into over the course of these next 2 lectures. Because of that, ecological restoration is a multidisciplinary science. So we need to take a look at the ecological aspects of ecological restoration, but we must also take a look at the socio-economic background of ecological restoration. We must find out the human use of the area and make sure that that human use is compatible with the restoring of that ecosystem. So now I want to talk about objectives of rehabilitation. Now be careful with this. I've been talking about restoration up until now, but now I want to start talking about rehabilitation. Basically, we can think of restoration as a subset or a particular objective of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation we can see as a whole group of activities, of human activities, which involve using plants and natural ecosystems to achieve some sort of human objective. There may be many different objectives to rehabilitation, and restoration is one of those. But to understand rehabilitation, we must take a look at some of the other objectives of rehabilitation. Some of these, well, many of these other objectives will also be served by restoration ecology. And as I've got written here, rehabilitation is the restoring of ecosystems functions that humans need. So rehabilitation is really putting an ecosystem in place which has ecosystem functions which humans need in that particular area. So those ecosystem functions may be soil or slope stabilization. It may be aesthetic needs, putting in a forest to hide some ugly factory or something like that. It may be some sort of production needs. We need to put in a woodland so that it forms a windbreak for an agricultural area. Or we need to restore or cover over a old mine site which at the moment is just bare earth. So rehabilitation of different ecosystem functions give different objectives for rehabilitation, and we'll take a look at 3 objectives of rehabilitation. We'll take a look at restoring or rehabilitating an area for soil stability or slope stability. We will look at rehabilitation for aesthetics, creating an ecosystem which is pleasant to look at in a human-managed landscape. We'll take a look at rehabilitation for restoration. So rehabilitation for slope stability, the objective there is to restore an ecosystem or to put in place an ecosystem which has the function of stabilizing soil or stabilizing a slope, preventing erosion. If we want to rehabilitate for aesthetic reasons, the ecosystem function there, which is of value to humans, is making the area look pretty, or to hide an ugly piece of human activity on a landscape. So the ecosystem function there would call for tall vegetation, which is able to hide things. So the ecosystem function there is to hide or to be tall and give humans an aesthetic pleasure, I guess. So soil stabilization, slope stabilization, one ecosystem function, or 2 ecosystem functions there. Aesthetics, another ecosystem function. If you plant for aesthetics, you quite often take care of soil stability as well. Restoration ecology now, or restoration, restores all of the ecosystem functions by putting the whole ecosystem back, including all the plants and animal species. You are essentially restoring all the ecosystem functions, and as you can imagine, that can be quite difficult. So in the short term, quite often what restoration ecology does is to return the ecosystem function of being resistant to fire and allowing the ecosystem to regenerate itself by accumulating the seed of all the other species which used to occur there over time through dispersal by animals or by wind and so on. Alright, so let's take a closer look at some of these objectives of rehabilitation. Soil stability. So soil stability, erosion of soil can be a major problem in some areas, particularly where the earth is left naked or uncovered by vegetation, particularly in a wet tropical environment when there's lots of rain about. You can get a lot of erosion of the soil, failure of the slopes, and so on. Particularly when there's any sort of construction like roads or rails, where cuttings or earth banks are created. A big part of or an essential part of the construction is quite often to cover these bare soil slopes with some sort of vegetation, some sort of ecosystem which will minimize erosion. Soil stability is really also very fundamental to any sort of rehabilitation effect, because if your soil is eroded, then your primary producers, your plants, are going to be disadvantaged. Their substrate and their nutrients will be lost. So soil stability is really one of the main objectives, or one of the main ecosystem functions, which need to be restored for any rehabilitation exercise. If the only goal is to stabilize soil, then it doesn't matter what sort of vegetation is used to stabilize that soil. We could use grass, we could use trees, we could use bushes, whatever species of grass. It could be a species of grass from Outer Mongolia. It doesn't matter, as long as that grass grows, as long as that grass has a soil stabilization capacity, then it can be used to restore that ecosystem function of stabilizing soil. So soil stability is one of the more easy rehabilitation objectives, because we can choose the vegetation, we can choose the species which are most likely to succeed. And those species need not be native. Those species may come from some other exotic location. Their genotype doesn't necessarily need to be of the local area. Instead, we just choose the genotype which is the best suited and gives the best chance of the plant growing and succeeding in that location, no matter what it is. So soil stability, or restoring that ecosystem function of soil stability, is fairly easy, because the choice of species can be made to maximize the chance of success in that particular environment. The next objective of rehabilitation, which I want to look at, is aesthetics. Many habitat restoration projects are to reduce visual pollution. So planting a strip of forest around an open-cut mine, for example, will prevent people seeing that open-cut mine, for instance around Valencia there. Having a strip of forest will make people feel good about their landscape. So planting an ecosystem, a rainforest ecosystem, for aesthetic effects is quite often something which is done around the world. In this particular case, the vegetation must blend in with the surroundings. So if it's a forest type natural ecosystem, then it's no use planting a savanna. You need to plant in some sort of forest type vegetation, trees. This vegetation must be able to stabilize the soil as well as growing up tall. So we immediately begin to be restricted in our choice of species. We can no longer choose the most hardy grass, and a type of grass which is used all around the world is called vetiver grass. They use it a lot in construction projects in Trinidad when they want to stabilize the bare slopes after finishing construction. You can't use that in aesthetic rehabilitation. You need to use trees. So immediately things become a bit harder, because trees will be harder to establish than the very hardy vetiver grass. So aesthetics, which provides another ecosystem function, that of making people feel good by growing up tall and screening unsightly activities, and also stabilizing soil, needs a choice of species, has a more restricted choice of species. So we would need to try and modify the microclimate more to cater for that more restricted choice of species. So this type of rehabilitation for aesthetics, as opposed to rehabilitation from soil stability, will quite often be more expensive, because you need to provide irrigation for the first dry season, fertilizer, maybe some shelter for the young seedlings over the first dry season before they're established. With the case of the vetiver grass, there's very low maintenance. You just have to stick the cuttings in the ground and walk away. The amount of rainfall you get in Trinidad, everywhere in Trinidad, is enough for vetiver grass to grow. So, aesthetics is more difficult than soil stabilization. The vegetation which is chosen must be able to achieve an aesthetic result. And that brings us on to our third objective of rehabilitation, which is restoration. And this is the most difficult form of rehabilitation, and that's the one that we need to try and use. Restoration is carried out to provide, as I said, a habitat for increasing numbers of plants and animals that are represented mainly in situ. One of the reasons why they are represented only in situ is that their habitats have been destroyed. So restoration of habitat, particularly in areas which can be protected, are quite often the only alternative for getting those plants and animals out of ex-situ conservation. So habitat restoration has grown in importance over time as ex-situ conservation becomes more successful, and there are plants and animals which need a habitat to be reintroduced into, and that habitat needs to be recreated in an area which is protected. So habitat restoration, or restoration ecology, is becoming more and more important. Now, if you are trying to restore the original ecosystem, you need to either have 100 years, or you need to be able to restore the ecosystem functions of that rainforest, for instance, which will allow it or set itself on a trajectory, a successional pathway, which will eventually culminate in all the species of the original ecosystem returning. It is the most difficult form of rehabilitation, because the only species that you can use, or that you try to end up with, are native species which were there before. That means you can choose the native species which are most likely to survive, but you need to modify the microclimates, the environment in the restoration area, so you can be sure that those native species can survive. So you cannot choose the species which is most likely to survive. Instead, you must choose the species which existed there before. So this makes restoration the most difficult form of rehabilitation. because of this restriction in the choice of species, many problems are caused. You have to be able to modify the microclimate so that the species can survive, and that takes time, money and resources. Soil stability can be attempted anywhere, but conservation requires careful site selection. Restoring for conservation is very difficult, and as I said, hasn't really been attempted by humans until the last couple of decades, when habitat destruction and degradation has meant that ecosystems or habitats need to be provided for species which no longer have their habitat left. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of restoration ecology. Now, this is really the history of modern day Western restoration ecology. There have been different types of restoration or rehabilitation by different human societies since time or records began. So, as I've got there in the first bullet, rehabilitation of ecosystems has been carried out since humans began managing ecosystems. So humans, in China, there are written records showing banks being planted by grasses to stabilize them. Fire stick farming by prehistoric humans is also a form of rehabilitation. It rehabilitates grassland as opposed to forest, because grassland was thought to be more important than forest to many of these subsistence hunters and gatherers. But the history of restoration ecology really starts to pick up pace, as I said, in the last couple of decades. And the techniques and the science which underpins that latest resurrection of restoration ecology began in the 1960s and 70s, and that was rehabilitation and reclamation attempts that were carried out on mine wastes. In a place like England, where the population density is very high, when you mine an area and you have areas of degraded or lands which are eroding and causing dust problems, rehabilitation is a matter of urgency, because there's always going to be people living close by. So a lot of work was carried out in rehabilitation, and in this case trying to plant what were seen as native grasslands back on top of these old mine sites. So rehabilitation, or the science of this restoration ecology, part of rehabilitation, started around the 1960s, 70s in England on mine wastes. But that was being carried out, but it was also being carried out in many other parts of the world, as the same problem occurred in these other parts of the world. So rehabilitation, soil stabilization, dust reduction and so on were all things which have been carried out, and it's from those experiences that the current science of restoration ecology comes from. Unfortunately, ecological restoration projects, such as those done in England, were quite often done in isolation by persons with an intimate knowledge of that ecosystem which was being restored. So, for instance, in England, they would have got somebody who knows how to grow grasslands, maybe an agriculturalist, and asked them to try and grow a grassland on these mine spoils. And this person would tinker around, try many different things until they finally succeeded. The same thing may happen in China, maybe with a forest, and the same thing may happen in the United States, trying to restore a mine site or something like that. So these different projects were all isolated they weren't carried out and built, and the knowledge wasn't transferred, and so it could be built upon, so people could learn from other people's mistakes, and so have their starting point for their project at the end point of the success of the last project, and so on. And so improve these restoration or rehabilitation attempts as they were then. So a development of a standard set of practices and their ecological basis is still moderately well developed. It's certainly still in its infancy. There's still ways in which things can be coordinated and sets of standard practices which could be followed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about manipulating succession, which is an attempt to try and bring restoration ecology into an ecological context of successional ecology, which is fairly well worked out in the scientific or the ecological literature. Many of these ecological restoration projects are still carried out on a case-by-case basis, but that is changing now. There are restoration, and particularly rainforest restoration projects, which is what we're focusing on, going on all around the world. This next slide shows a couple of fellas, scientists up in northeast Queensland in Australia, who wrote a manual of rainforest restoration called Repairing the Rainforest. Steve Goosom and Nigel Tucker, I think it is. Okay, I think this is Steve Goosom, this is Nigel Tucker. I've been to the areas where they've done a lot of this rainforest restoration. We have the soft copy of this book as a PDF. I have the link on the My Learning website, so it's well worth a skim through. Definitely some areas where you need to read a little bit more. The next lecture on techniques for restoration is taken largely from this manual of rainforest restoration. And it's this type of manual which is needed to allow, for instance, people in Trinidad to learn from the mistakes and learn from the experiences of the people who were restoring rainforests 20 years ago in Australia. And here's a rainforest restoration project ongoing in Australia in that same northeast Queensland area. This is actually a picture from the school where I worked for a year learning all about rainforest restoration and restoration ecology. So these are all seedlings of trees which are being planted in a prepared site which has been sprayed with herbicides for 2 or 3 times and had all the existing weedy vegetation removed. These seedlings are planted and surrounded by plastic to form microclimates which are humid and warm and favour the survival of that species, and also allows people to walk through these areas and continue to spray the weeds with herbicides and reduce the competition to allow that seedling to survive. There is also another link which I put up on the My Learning website. We've got a link to this book, but we also have a link to the Journal of Ecological Management and Restoration, I believe, which is one of the journals, again out of Australia, which focuses in on ecological restoration. So these things basically show us how the expertise and the experiences is now being shared by scientists through like a scientific process to allow people to plan their own restoration attempts, learning from the mistakes of others. And this is the birth of the development of a science. And again, the reason for it is loss of habitats for endangered species and the need to try and restore them. Okay, let's take a look at one of the bases for putting restoration in an ecological context. And this is taken from a seminal publication called, what was it called? Directing Succession for Restoration, or just Directing Succession. I have to dig that book out. I can't remember the exact title or the author. But in it, there was an attempt to put restoration ecology into a ecological successional framework. And I just want to run through basically what this particular publication advocated. And you can think of restoration as manipulating these different successional stages to achieve that restored ecosystem with time. So, what is succession? Succession is the directional change in an ecosystem community with time. And we can think of succession as 3 different stages which can be manipulated. Just going to pause for a minute and come back. Okay, back again. Succession has 3 stages which can be manipulated, and I've got those 3 stages there. Disturbances initiating succession, so you can manipulate the type, the strength, the degradation, the destruction of the disturbance which starts off the succession. The second part of succession which can be manipulated is the immigration of propagules. We can manipulate what sort of species and what sort of stage those species enter the ecosystem which has been newly disturbed. And finally, we can make the different species which are introduced into the ecosystem differently performing. We can favor some species over other species by doing things like fertilizing them, irrigating them, or putting plastic around them to create a nice humid microclimate so that they don't desiccate in the dry season. So let's go through some of these different stages quickly. Disturbances either create bare ground or remove the dominance. This is quite often very important in restoration ecology. Natural disturbances would be fires, landslides, tree falls, hurricanes, floods. But humans can provide non-natural disturbances with tractors and herbicides to also create bare ground. Now, it's important to create these bare ground, particularly when it comes to rainforest restoration. Now, as I said before, in the tropics, you would quite often have a grass-dominated ecosystem, which is very prone to fire during the dry season. So one of the things which is critical to be carried out is protection from fire, and that ecosystem needs to be able to protect itself from fire. And as you learnt in rainforest ecology and use, because the understory of a rainforest is quite humid and damp and shaded, it is less likely to burn. Okay? So we want to try and remove all those grasses, all those other competing shrubs and so on from that ecosystem, because they are all going to compete with our seedlings. So what is recommended from the Australian experience is basically removing all vegetation from the area to be restored, removing all competition from the seedlings which you are going to plant, which are going to form the basis for the restoration. The agricultural systems also mimic this, so we have machinery which can, and techniques which can remove all the weedy stuff which is going to compete with our restoration plantings. And it's recommended that this be done. So we go in with a tractor first of all, mechanically remove all the vegetation, the grass, the shrubs which have grown up, and then we can go in there and spray the cut vegetation, so kill off everything which did not get removed or killed by the mechanical removal. You probably would need to spray with the herbicide more than once, and at the end you will get a bare site like this, which is mulched by or protected to a certain degree by the dead organic matter on top, and that dead organic matter will also provide some sort of nutrient source for the seedlings. Now you should be using herbicides which has no residual effect. Things like Roundup is quite short-lived, okay, in the ecosystem, so it won't affect the seedlings once they are planted. But preparing the site is of critical importance. By preparing the site, you make the maintenance or the differential performance of your seedlings much more likely to succeed, because in the experience of restorers in Australia, one of the main reasons why restoration fails is because the seedlings will get swamped by competitors, mainly grass, before that they are able to grow tall enough to escape and close the canopy and shade the grass out. So if you can remove all those competitors before you plant the seedlings, you are much more likely to create a situation where your seedlings can survive. You know, seedlings are trees which are of the rainforest. The second way in which we can manipulate succession is through immigration of propagules. So what are propagules? Propagules are seeds and seedlings or pieces of root or so on, anything which will generate a new individual of a species. Propagules will move around the landscape by wind, water, animals and gravity, and our aim of our restoration is to move propagules of our favoured species into the restoration site after it has been cleared and all the competition removed. So a big part of restoration is to grow up seedlings of our preferred species, and here is a nursery. This is in Ecuador, I think, but you would see similar sorts of things in Australia, in Brazil and so on. You would need to grow up the seedlings that you wish to plant beforehand and then plant them in your prepared ecosystem. And here's a couple of examples of planting seedlings. These seedlings are bare, they don't have any shelters around them. These seedlings have shelters around them. I know this site here is probably prone to frosts and cold weather during the dry season, because this is up at an altitude of about 800 meters above sea level. This area is at sea level, so these seedlings aren't going to get frostbitten, but they probably need to have some sort of shelter to reduce the evapotranspirative load on them during the dry season so they don't desiccate. Tree shelters can maintain that humidity around the seedlings. So the humans will swamp that ecosystem with propagules, mostly seedlings, because seedlings are much more likely to survive. But you could also use seed. Generally, the type of seed which would be most useful would be early successional selected species, which can take advantage of the vast amount of resources which are available in a bare, open, prepared area. So humans will swamp the newly created bare ecosystem with propagules of their choosing to achieve their objective. And if the objective is restoration, then they will be native seeds or seedlings, usually seedlings, of the species which were originally there. If you have hundreds and hundreds of seedlings and seeds of your favoured species, they are going to swamp and outcompete, hopefully, all the other weedy species that you don't want there. Although in my experience, you still need some sort of control to favour your propagules. And that's where the third way of manipulating succession comes in, and that's with differential species performance. Species will grow differently due to different abiotic conditions. Humans can change those abiotic conditions to favour your species. You can have targeted fertilizing. So when you plant your seedlings, you can put a handful of slow release fertilizer in the bottom of the hole and plant the seedling on top of it. You can weed or apply herbicide to remove the competitive species. In this way, you can favour your seedlings and knock back the competitors, and so allow your seedlings to reach a stage after maybe 5 years or so when they don't need any more help. They are now the dominant species in the ecosystem, and they no longer require your help, and they can take over by themselves. And that would be the point where your restoration project has succeeded. Now, agriculture is a prime example of manipulating succession. All of these stages that we have seen, manipulating the disturbance, the immigration of propagules, and the performance of the species in the area, are things which agriculture does. So we can quite often use a few of these agricultural techniques to favour our restoration attempt. Alright, so that's all I really want to talk about with objectives of restoration. So we've gone through some of the definitions of restoration ecology. We've seen how restoration ecology fits in to the overall rehabilitation of ecosystems to restore certain ecosystem functions. We've seen a brief history of restoration ecology, and finally we've gone through how we can manipulate succession through ecological means to favour or to achieve restoration goals. Okay, so thank you very much for listening and taking your notes, and I'll see you in the next lecture, Restoration Techniques.